to the CEC Report for the 20th of November 2015. I'm Elisa Barwick, and joining me today is CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, Prince Charles cracks down on CEC in Albany, and justice for Paris means exposing Crown's role in terrorism. So firstly, Prince Charles cracks down on CEC in Albany. Now, the background to this story is, of course, that 1 week ago to today, we saw the incredible attacks upon Paris and the 130 deaths that came as a result of that. But let me stress that this is not the only terrorist incident that we've had in the last couple of weeks. We did, of course, have more than 40 people killed and many more injured on the streets of Beirut in Lebanon. And also this week, President Putin did confirm that the downing of the Metro jet over the Sinai in Egypt was in fact a terrorist bombing, was conducted by ISIS, and of course that killed 224 people there. Now, what we're seeing though with Paris is a type of terrorism that was instigated at the point and somewhat tested out of the Mumbai bombing in 2008. And something that's easier for terrorists to pull off than a 9/11 type event, but with maximum casualties, because of course you can take effective action to prevent what happened in 9/11. However, this kind of activity is easier to pull off because it's, cities are large, you can't control everything. And it's also what we call blind terrorism, because it's not aimed at particular individuals, but at the general population. So it breeds fear, and it threatens the way of life of people living in a city like Paris, or indeed anywhere in the world who are threatened by that. So that's the big story, and we're going to spend much of the show talking today about the basis for the creation of that terrorism historically and how we can put an end to it. But first of all, we want to talk a little bit about what happened within hours of the Paris attack in Albany, Western Australia, where the Albany show was going on, and our activists over in Western Australia, as they do every year for countless years, have a stall there.
Which we've been invited to, Elisa, for the last 3 years. So
we do this regularly, and we'd spent a full day organising on the Friday and attracting a lot of attention, getting a lot of good discussions with people about what's going on in the world. But what happened on Saturday morning, before our organisers rolled up to the stall for the day, was that they received a call from the Federal Police. And then when they turned up to the stall, they were met by 1 federal policeman, 5 state police, 2 security guards, and the convener of the show. And they were questioned at length over our position on various issues, including our stance on Muslims. The police were very satisfied and quite surprised at our views being so straightforward, and that we welcome Muslims and other immigrants to this country. We didn't have any, fantastical or extreme views in their opinion. They were quite agreeable to what we laid out. However, we were given move-on orders. We had to leave, in fact, go outside of a 25-kilometre radius of Albany for the duration of the visit of Prince Charles and Camilla, who were attending the show that day. So they had to leave the city. They had an hour and a half to do so. One of our activists, and there were 2 people in their 90s that were there, great threat to Prince Charles, of course, but one of them is a local resident of Albany. So when we said, well, hang on, does he really have to be outside 25 kilometres of the city? They, said, okay, well, he can remain in his home within that period of time. Exactly, for this 90-year-old who was a veteran fighting against the Nazis in Europe. When we asked them what was the reason for all this, they said to us, look, what happened in Paris was a big deal. But because we've always been at this show, we've never had a problem before. Obviously, this must have come from Prince Charles and his contingent. But what did you have to say about it, Craig, in the press release we issued?
Well, look, Lisa, the question immediately arises. We're in the same pavilion as the Labor and Liberal parties. Why wasn't this applied to them? Well, we know why it wasn't applied to them. It's because we have been the most vocal political opponents of Prince Charles and what he represents for many, many years. I mean, this show event was organised 6 months ago, before Charles was even announced he was coming to Albany. We've been to many, many shows around the country, using the same signage One of the signs that they didn't like was our sign of Prince Charles of Arabia, where we have been very vocal opponents pointing out to people that Prince Charles is very closely associated with the finances of international terrorism, the Saudi Arabians. And we've got, we did a new citizen and spread that around the country en masse. Now, the police feigned that they didn't know us, they didn't know who we are, which is absolutely absurd. I mean, we've been a political party vigorously campaigning for 27 years in this country, and for us to be issued move-on orders, which are usually used to move on groups or people where the police think that there's some sort of violence going to happen, is absolutely an outrage.
Yes.
And it was raising many, many questions about exactly what are these anti-terrorism laws designed to do. Now, what we're looking at here, people might say, oh, well, this is just the police doing their job and so forth. No, look, that's a complete fallacy. These things are organised top down, and of course Prince Charles is never seen to be very closely involved in all of this, but we know that the only reason this could have happened is because the orders came down from on high, from Prince Charles himself, who knows us intimately because of not just the political exposés we've done on the funding of terrorism, but also just the week before, we highlighted his role in the sacking of Goss Whitlam. And our press releases go out to 500,000 people, Elisa. So this would have gone out to him and to his networks. We've also been vigorously opposing his stance on green fascism, on the environmentalist movement. We're well known of all these sorts of things. And also, we've also been very vocal, as people who know our press releases and our material, on Prince Charles' links to various famous pedophiles, one of those being Jimmy Savile. Right, so he knows that we are the most vigorous and vocal opponents of him politically, and his ideas politically, but not to his person. We are a totally non-violent group, and historically people can go back and see our links with people, very famous people like Amelia Boynton Robinson, who work with Martin Luther King. That is our heritage. But this is not the issue for the police or for the local police in particular. They're following orders.
Yeah.
They can't not follow orders.
And we've also done major exposés on the green fascist agenda, and in recent times, because of the lead up to the Paris summit, the COP21 summit, which is the United Nations agenda of getting through across the board mandatory regulations and reductions of carbon dioxide. And of course Prince Charles and his father Prince Philip are a key part in that. So, we are no physical threat, there's no two ways about that, but we are an absolute dire political threat to them and their agenda. And what you're really seeing here is what we've always said, which is that terrorism is used to bring down police state laws, but it's not to protect people from terrorism, it's to destroy, and it is destroying, freedom of speech, to actually challenge the sorts of things that we challenge, because we might create controversy wherever we go, but there's nothing wrong with that.
Well,
that's not illegal yet.
There is something wrong with that, and that it challenges the existing parties. And as I said, the two parties were at this show, and they usually give away balloons or trinkets like that, right? That's all they do. One of the complaints that we heard from the Show Society there was that we were blocking the pathways because so many people were interested in our ideas that people couldn't get through. And you're not supposed to do that. And as our State Secretary, Jean Robinson, explains, we try and not let that happen, but there's just so much interest in what we have to say that people want to stand around and they want to talk to us.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting, because if the other political parties see that, they say, oh boy, we're in trouble here.
That's right.
And that's what we're seeing across the country. When we are allowed to get our message out, people say, well, I like these ideas. Even the police had no issue with our policies.
But we have to follow these orders, they said.
And where the orders are coming from. Well, they don't necessarily know where the orders are coming from, but they have to act on the basis of orders given. They can't be arbitrary about it. And it was interesting that the initial move-on orders were very severe. And after a discussion with our State Secretary, Jean, who explained the situation, they realised that they couldn't enforce these severe move-on orders because actually there was no basis to it. But they couldn't also get out of it because they had their orders.
Yeah, so they wound it back slightly. But
yeah, so this is an ongoing issue, Elisa, because it actually is a very serious issue, because what it is doing is it is now counterposing the anti-terrorism laws with a federally registered political party for 27 years and our actual constitutional rights for free speech and political expression.
Yep.
So you have these two bodies of law coming into conflict, and the issue is for the police and for the federal police, have they breached actually very important political freedom laws and so forth? I mean, look, Prince Charles doesn't care about this sort of stuff. These oligarchs, these princes, these royals, they don't care about this stuff. I mean, they violate the sovereignty of nations in order to push their oligarchical views. But in terms of what we've seen in Syria, for example, the rule of international law, the sovereignty of nations, the way constitutions are governing the rule of how countries operate is very, very important. Obama and these guys, as we've witnessed in Syria, just overrule the rule of law within countries, the constitutions, and they go in under this arbitrary power of we have the right to protect, the responsibility to protect, because we, in a sense, set ourselves up as the arbitrators to determine who and what we can do. You have a system like that, which Putin has opposed and done everything, in a sense, by the rule book, international law. When you throw that rule of law out, you end up with chaos, anarchy. You end up with the mess that we've got in the Middle East right now.
We've got to take a quick break, but we're going to continue talking about this after the break, and in particular, how we can wind back that scenario. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Justice for Paris means exposing role of Crown in terrorism. So now we want to look a bit at what's really behind the drive of international terrorism, who's fostering and funding it. It just doesn't come from nowhere. Now, Craig, we identify the role of the Crown and the British Empire consistently in international terrorism. But before we get into the details of that, explain to our viewers why we say that, because I'm sure there's people out there who, there's been a lot of people like after 9/11 that after these Paris attacks are asking the questions, and they're going to the internet for the first time to try to figure out where is all this coming from. They're scared, etc. But most people might, if they haven't looked into it, assume that the British Empire doesn't exist, the Crown is just a figurehead apparatus that is relevant only for Britain or something. So why do we say this? What's really...
Well, Elisa, you have to go back into history, and people don't have much of a sense of history these days, but the British Empire coming into the 20th century was the most powerful institution surrounding the likes of King Edward VII that the world had ever seen. It ruled the world through trade and all sorts of, through gunboats and redcoats, as we used to call them. They used to physically have the capability of literally blowing nations out of the water. Now, over time, that power has disintegrated from a military point of view into actually a financial oligarchy, where things are run through boardrooms, through banks, through the control of finances. Now, what we're getting into in this recent period is that this empire, which runs the big banks, the City of London and Wall Street and so forth, are losing its powers because the entire system is starting to disintegrate, as we know from the global financial crisis. So what has happened since 2001, within the September 11th attacks, that was designed by the oligarchy. Now, we know it's been funded by the Saudis. There's 28 pages of the congressional report that was done in 2002, that have never been released, these secret 28 pages, which goes through the actual apparatus that went into funding and naming the names of who did this, and this was Saudi Arabia. And what you find is that you have a network of finance. If you go back into an arrangement called Al Yamama, you'll find that the British Crown directly, through Prince Charles, did a deal with the Saudis in an oil for arms deal worth something in the vicinity of $80 billion. Now, that money has gone in to fund international terrorism. We know that. Yep. So you have this very close collaboration between the royal family, the British Empire, and the Saudis, funding international terrorism. But the real key of international terrorism is to be used as a battering ram to smash the sovereignty of nations. Because anyone that studies empire throughout history understands that empires are basically the governing mechanism, the tool of an oligarchy, where the oligarchy believes that people are nothing more than human cattle, and all the institutions have to serve, including these human cattle, the oligarchy. Whereas the opposite of that is the idea of a community of sovereign nation states, which is what the BRICS represents, the BRICS countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which is now challenging that order. So mass terrorist events, terrorism itself is a tool and it's always run by states. It is not run by individuals in some cave in Afghanistan. It is a tool to destroy and smash sovereignty of nation states. And that's why we're so clear that the British Empire still exists today in a different form. It's a financial oligarchy that is using terrorism as a battering ram to smash the sovereignty of nations. And the policies you see come forward are the policies like the responsibility to protect, which smashed Iraq, killed Saddam Hussein, but left behind a failed state. Did the same in Libya, killed Gaddafi, left behind a failed state. Afghanistan, same issue. And now with Syria, the intention by Cameron and Obama is to have regime change there, get rid of Assad, overthrow the lawful, even if it's a bad dictator or whatever, it does not matter. If you overthrow the structures of how a country is governed, then you end up in a failed state. And that was made very clear by a number of the leading generals in the United States, that was actually the intention of Obama. So these are the crucial issues that people have to understand when it comes to understanding international terrorism.
Yeah. It's
not run by people in back caves of Afghanistan.
Well, the centre of it is very clearly London, which earned the nickname amongst many high-level circles, Londonistan. The Al Yamama deal that you mentioned earlier was set up in 1983 between Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who was, of course, the former Saudi ambassador to the United States and the head of Saudi intelligence for a time.
Yeah, we published 250,000 new citizens on this, Elisa, which we've still got a few copies left, going through this exact nature of this deal.
Well, he set that up with Margaret Thatcher, so that was 1983, and they funneled $3 billion to the Mujahideen. They created a slush fund in the trade between Saudi and UK arms for oil deals, and there was a lot of excess money that accrued that was funneled into this funding of terrorist apparatus, the Mujahideen initially, which became and bred Al-Qaeda. Now, Prince Charles personally took over the negotiations for the Al Yamama deal in the 1990s, so he personally continued that role. He's had a very close personal relationship with Prince Bandar bin Sultan, whom I mentioned, and with another key figure in running this terrorist apparatus, Prince Turki bin Faisal, who was...
They both came to the wedding. Yeah,
they were 2 of only 8 foreign royals that were invited to Prince Charles and Camilla's wedding. So it shows you how close they were. Of course, Prince Turki was the head of Saudi intelligence for more than 20 years. He was named, along with Prince Bandar, in suits filed by the 9/11 families in court cases as having funded 9/11. But these kind of investigations, such as the 9/11 families lawsuit and investigations in Britain into Al Yamama, it has been documented, were personally obstructed by Prince Charles, where he has interfered to shut these operations or these investigations down.
So you can see why Prince Charles didn't want us at Albany.
Exactly. And Charles even was the key figure who convinced Saudi King Fahd in the early 1990s to put $10 million into building mosques, which includes the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, which churned out such figures as Abu Hamza, who, when he was imprisoned, he's imprisoned in the United States now, playing a key role in setting up 9/11, he actually told them in the court case, look, I was working for MI5. So this is a very clear apparatus. These people had a covenant of security, they called it, where they were protected for operating inside London, out of these mosques and so forth, as long as they didn't wreak too much havoc in London itself. Yeah. So this is the apparatus we have to expose, and we'll keep talking about how we're going to do that after the break. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing Justice for Paris means exposing Crown's role in terrorism. Now, I'll just add to what we were saying earlier, that Senator Bob Graham from the United States Congress he actually warned on the day of the attacks, which occurred January 7th this year. Those were the attacks on Paris on the Charlie Hebdo officers. We had a press conference that day on Capitol Hill. He was there with the 9/11 families, and he said at that point that if the 28 pages from the 9/11 Commission report that were redacted had been released, he said this would have never occurred, this attack. And that's doubly true of today. If everything we've been putting out there is on the record, is known, there's no way that they would get away with this.
And that intersects all the strategic issues currently going on, particularly around what Russia's doing in Syria and so forth.
Exactly, because I think the timing of this recent spate of terrorism that we've seen in the last few weeks is not accidental. Russia intervened at the end of September, early October, with the United Nations General Assembly, at which Putin declared we are going to create an international apparatus. And you know, when he says it, it's serious. It's not like Obama saying we're going to put down terrorism. This was serious. We're going to actually stop ISIS in its tracks. And they've largely done that. I mean, they're about to take back, with the help of the Syrian army on the ground, Aleppo and Raqqa, which is the mainstays of the ISIS operation. So there's been a dramatic military shift. There's been a dramatic shift diplomatically between Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, and Kerry, the US Secretary of State, bringing together 20 countries and blocks of countries from the region to actually say, all right, we'll put the issue of Assad to the side. We need to have Syria involved, setting up new elections to actually resolve this situation.
And lo and behold, Julie Bishop even agrees.
Exactly.
Which is stunning.
Yeah, and what was really hilarious though is that she felt snubbed by the fact that the Russians excluded Australia from the table at Vienna. And, you know, so she should, because we've snubbed the Russians in a repeated and ongoing way. We put them to blame for all of the disasters, you know, not just MH17. But the faction around Kerry in the United States, I will say, the anti-war faction with various military figures are being strengthened now. After Paris, you have more and more countries that are beginning to say, yes, we do have to work together. You can't take them all at face value. You know, the British come out 1 minute and say, yes, we have to work with Russia, and then they turn around the next day and say, no, Assad's a butcher, he's got to be the main target here. But what Putin did at the G20 was really crucial in setting the real standard that if you are serious about ISIS, you have to go after the funding, because he named and he said, I delivered all the evidence of this, the intelligence documents, showing there are 40 nations that are funding ISIS, and they include G20 nations present here today. So that was a major intervention that he made, and you can see video of the oil tankers that are taking oil into Turkey and so forth to fund ISIS. So this could be shut down in a heartbeat, Craig. I mean, there is a shift. We've got to take advantage of this moment post-Paris, that people are waking up, that countries are saying we've got to take action. But what's the key thing that we have to do to make that work, to take advantage of this shift? The 9/11 pages, I think, is a key thing, that we've got to start with that, but we also have to get out our exposés. People can call in for a copy of our New Citizen paper, but also get our material on an ongoing basis where, you know, we're on the record of exposing this stuff.
Yes, and look, it comes down to the issue of people fully understanding what's going on. We're in a somewhat of a Pearl Harbor moment, but they don't last very long.
No.
Right? Because people have been, and we've noticed a bit of this on the streets where people have been shook up there. I mean, this Paris event was such a horrible event that this could happen to anyone. So why is this happening? And this is putting itself pressure on leaders, but it requires a vocal population to say, look, we don't tolerate this anymore. That's what we saw at Albany.
Yeah.
And that's why they freaked out. And that's what's very, very important, that people do get copies of our Australian Alert Service, and you'll find all the material, which they may find a bit hard to believe. Get it, read it, educate yourself, and figure things out.
This document, which we held a conference on this subject and how to bring the BRICS countries to a new economic order, that's got much more information too. So thanks for tuning into the CEC Report. Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.
And join us again next week.